Hi, I'm John Cerruto, and welcome tonight to our speaker series here at the Summit Library, hosted by the Summit Library and HTTV right here in Summit, New Jersey. Tonight's guest, a Pulitzer Prize finalist, an author, an award-winning investigative columnist, and somebody who I've always felt knows the pulse of New Jersey better than anybody else in the state. He has the great ability to express the social and economic culture of our state. But he took that skill and ventured into Russia and Ukraine over the last year and made multiple visits. And here tonight, he's going to share his experiences and his thoughts on that. So without any further ado, please welcome Summit's Mark Ionno.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Mark and I were talking, and what we will do is have Mark do his normal overview of what he's experiencing. He'll get into depth a little bit with pictures and kind of a PowerPoint format. We will break away, ask questions from the audience, come back in, ask questions from the audience, and then summarize it. So, Mark, what motivated you, first of all, to all of a sudden pick up from this great state of New Jersey and head into foreign territory?
Well, in one word, basically anger. Like what motivates me most of the time. I'm a veteran. I was in the Navy during the Cold War, 1975, 1979, and my view on this was that as we had prepared for this moment when Russia invaded a European democratic nation. This was the moment we prepared for 75 years. This is why we spent the trillions of dollars on weapon systems. This is why NATO was formed. It was all for this moment. And then the moment came, and the bluff was not called. And frankly, I was outraged by that then. I'm outraged by it now. What's happening in this country and how we are supplying them with weapons, but they're the ones doing the bleeding. And even at this stage, you have to ask yourself, what is the tipping point of the humanitarian crisis before the world decides to get involved in this? And anybody who understands the Soviet mentality shouldn't be surprised by that at all, because this is what they do. It's scorched earth tactics, murder of civilians, wholesale murder of people from the Soviet takeover 100 years ago, more on.
So Mark, but I know it's basic to most of us. We hear the reasons why, but what is the real genesis behind the attack?
Well, it's really an interesting history because Russia says, Ukraine is part of Russia, but actually, if you look at the history, Russia belongs to Ukraine because the Kievan Rus Foundation starts in Kiev and spread toward Russia. So this idea that they're intermingled and all of that, their cultures are intermingled, is correct. But for some reason, the Russian mentality is and has been, the Soviet mentality has been, we need to control everything around us. And it's predatory, it's obviously a predatory mentality. And so Ukraine was the first Soviet state. The Russians invaded Kiev in 1921. It's 100 years ago that they went in and they invaded Ukraine and they took Ukraine over. And this is complicated history. There's factions involved and stuff like that. But I think the big thing is to understand that the entire time that they have been involved in Ukraine has led to the deaths of millions of people and the destruction of the country. We all know about the Holocaust, but in Ukraine there was the Holodomor, which was the forced starvation of between 5 and 10 million Ukrainians by Joseph Stalin in the 30s. When the Nazis came in to march on Moscow, the Russians destroyed Kiev, in the face of the Nazi advance. They booby-trapped all the buildings. So Ukraine, in some ways has just been victimized by that Soviet mentality, and prior to that, the Tsarist mentality, for hundreds of years. And so that's the genesis of it, is just predatory, Soviet mentality.
Now, how about the fact that Ukraine, which I believe was the second largest of the Soviet satellites over the years,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Has so much natural resources, power, access to the Black Sea.
Mm-hmm.
All that came into play in Putin's decision to move forward to try to capture and control.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that I found out, that's not hard to find out, but Ukraine's agricultural production and it has improved 10 times, is 10 times greater than it was when they were under Soviet rule. They have a burgeoning tech industry, burgeoning manufacturing industry. They have all these natural resources that the Soviet Union did not mine. So it's basically like, okay, we'll let you go. Oh, now you're successful. We want you back. And I think that is a large part of it. Ukraine has the most farmable land in the world after us. They have the largest amount of black soil in the world after us. They are the largest food producer in the world after us. And not just wheat and sunflowers, but also produce, vegetables, meats. I mean, the food that they have in their local stands looks like something you see in King's. It's wonderful quality. So the country is very productive, and I actually think that plays into some of the slow walking by the French and the Germans too, because they see Poland and Ukraine as growing economic threats to them. Because whatever Germany and France can do, Ukraine already outproduces France in food. Whatever Germany and France can do, Ukraine and Poland will be able to do better, sooner, cheaper. People work harder, all that stuff. So I think there's a lot of geopolitical stuff going on here. Part of which I'm ashamed to admit and say is our weapons industry makes money off this. This is what we've always done. This is why we've propped Russia up as this boogeyman to the rest of the world for 75 years, to sell weapons, to sell people, to capitalize on their fear of Russia. Now Russia invades Ukraine. The Ukrainians punch the bully in the nose outside of Kyiv and send them running home, and that's when everybody else decides to jump into the war. And we can't forget that part, I think, as we look back on this historically. We did almost nothing except throw up some sanctions that were going to take years to work, if at all. We did nothing until the Ukrainians drove them out of Kyiv. And I think the United States shamefully, and the rest of the West shamefully, were hoping the Ukrainians would just roll over. And the evidence of this is in the very beginning of the war, when our president offers Zelensky a way out of the country, and Zelensky sets the tone by saying, I don't want to ride, I want weapons. And that sets the tone for the war. I really believe, and this is part of my motivation for going, is we were hoping they would just roll over.
All right, so now you not only go over for your first visit, but you followed it up with 3 other visits, and you're leaving right after Christmas for an extended stay again. The first time you went, Poland, Ukraine, where did you land? What was your role? What were you finding from the people?
So I read in the New York Times. I was following the war, the beginning of the war, the posturing, and then the convoy positioning, which is very curious to me that he had this convoy just sitting there for 10 days, a sitting duck, and I've come to actually believe that maybe he wanted us to tell him to go home, because I don't understand how a guy that's supposed to be so smart could send such an ill-equipped, ill-trained army to invade a country like that. And we've all heard about how badly they've done and continue to do. But I read in the New York Times that that they were coming out of Ukraine, women and children, by the hundreds of thousands and eventually millions. And there was an article about this town called Lublin, which is the biggest city in eastern Poland. I can put it up on a map here, John, if you want.
Yeah, be good.
This is always problematic, but in Lublin, and that is over here, if you can see. Oops, we don't want it that big. Lublin is sort of in a direct line from Kyiv by way of highway and rail. Where's Kyiv here? You see, Kyiv is over here, and there's Lublin. I flew to Warsaw from Newark, direct flight, rented a car, and I drove to Lublin, which is about an hour, about 2-hour drive, with absolutely no idea what I was going to do or where I was going to go, except that there was a sports arena that, much like we do when the Red Cross sets up gymnasiums in natural disasters, they had set this up for these Ukrainian refugees. And so I went to Lublin and figured, let me see if I can help in this place. And that led me to my first night in Ukraine. And I'll just show you quickly here. And that's when I began to meet the people. And this is the first family that I met in a hotel Huszar. What? Be careful.
Yeah, just one.
And just this picture here, the tall woman is the woman in the first picture. This is her mother. This is her sister-in-law and the daughter-in-law of the mother, who's a 19-year-old girl and is pregnant. And the little guy here is her son. In talking to these women, I realized that these women were leaving the country, not knowing where they were going, not just these four, but everybody, not knowing where they were going, many of them, or if their husband's home or country would ever be there for them to go back to. And to be cast out into the world like that, forced out of your homes, being bombed, fearing for your life, fearing for everything. And the Polish generosity was really enormous. And so the first night that I was there, I came upon, outside of my window, I heard the one-note drone of this bus, and I looked out, and these volunteers were unloading about 40 severely handicapped people. No two wheelchairs were alike. That's how different their medical complications were. So I went down and I helped unload these people, and we got them up and situated in their rooms. And by the time we were done, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. They reloaded them at 6 in the morning, and they had gone from Kyiv to Lublin to Berlin, then to the Netherlands for a permanent place with 40 people and 4 volunteers. And so this was just an example of the desperation that we saw there. The following day, I then got in the rental car and I drove from Lublin about an hour or so to the border. And I spent most of my time in this city called Helm, but that wasn't close enough. So I ended up driving and ending up in this little town right on the border called Dorarusk. And I can't see now, geez.
Right to your left.
Right to my left, here, okay. Dorarusk is on the border, the river is there. I didn't realize there was a river in between the countries. And so I knew I couldn't drive the rental car into Ukraine. But I was a reporter, so I figured I'll figure out a way to get through there. And then I realized there was a river, so that was the end of that. But in Dorarusk, I found a reception site, and I'll show the pictures in a minute of that. And that's where I basically showed up and said, I'm an American and I'm here to help. And it was the reception site had a Caritas which is the Catholic Relief Agency of the International, had a Caritas site, and I worked there for the next, really, I kept going back there. I went back to that place 3 times. So one of the things that I did there also was I transported families out of the reception center there deeper into Poland, as far as Berlin, multiple trips to Warsaw, multiple trips to Krakow, multiple trips to cities I can't pronounce, and and this family here is kind of important. These are the first people I transported, and it's a mom. She's bending over. The teenage daughter's at the door, trying to unlock this hotel room. A little girl, and there's a mother-in-law. And this woman was from the Sumy region of Ukraine, which was she lived 10 kilometers from the Russian border. And the Russians came and said, "We're going to start bombing here. We will take you back over if you want to go, and you'll be safe in Russia." And the woman was astute enough to know that when they came back the next time, they weren't going to ask. And so she gathered up as much stuff as she could in her family and took, between buses and trains, 36 hours to go 580 miles from Sumy to Dorusk, Poland, for freedom. And to me, and I wrote this, the price of the value that they put on freedom, the Ukrainians, and between the exodus and the war effort is astonishing. And we, as a country, I mean, we could really learn a lot from them. So in Dorusk, this big yellow building in the background is the reception point. It was a big public building in this very, very small rural town. The borders of Ukraine and Poland are very rural. And so I worked there, unloading stuff from people taking families like this. Again, the demographic, young women, 2 kids, mother-in-law, mother, unpacking stuff, packing stuff up to take to the border itself, where the Ukrainians were coming off buses and needed stuff. They've been on the bus for 27 hours. They're hungry, they're thirsty. They need stuff to sort of sustain themselves for whatever is next. Getting to the border and through the border is only part of the journey for many of them. And this is what the Caritas place looked like. This is so early on in the war that we didn't even have ways to shelter all these donations. And miraculously, this was in the first week of March or so, it didn't rain or snow for the first 2 weeks I was there. So we had time to shelter this stuff eventually. And this is where we would bring stuff as they came off these buses from the Ukrainian side into Poland. And I actually, in the first trip, I stuck a toe into Ukraine on the other side of the Dorusk border. Again, just the demographic is, women and children. And this is a scene from the Helm train station, which is on the direct line from Kyiv. And this picture, again, it just speaks volumes in terms of what the ordeal was. There's this mother chowing down a piece of pizza with, an 18-month-old on her lap, a 5 and a 7-year-old, and those kids and her loved all that stuff, from wherever they were from in Ukraine, on the trains, buses, through customs, on both sides of the border, just this incredibly arduous trip that, I just felt people should, I was writing about this and I was sending pictures, and, we should have a sense of what this migration of 4 million people was like, and how hard it was for these people to just pack everything of any value, anything that you felt you needed, and just get, thrown out into the world. This is sort of the site at these reception centers at the border where we would go. Another demographic picture. And the other thing the other demographic were the elderly. And this woman was traveling alone and really, functioning on the goodwill of other people to help her carry the stuff that she had to take, to sustain her life wherever she was going. In Helm, there was also a sports arena that was used as a refugee center. Again, it reminded me of like Hurricane Sandy and other things like that I'd covered, floods where abruptly people are just tossed out of their homes and take whatever they can, and they end up sleeping in a gymnasium for a few weeks.
So, Mark, let me ask you, in March, of course, it was still early on, and this was the huge migration out of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
You're dealing with these people really on the front line. How did you find their morale? Were they scared, obviously angered, but did they feel patriotic, that they want to eventually return to Ukraine? Was that the ultimate goal?
I never met a single person in my 5 months there that believed they were going to lose that war, that wouldn't make sacrifices to win that war, and they spoke of the war in terms of when our victory comes, when we win the war, our victory comes, we'll go home. And at first I was disgusted with the United States because, there's 4 million refugees and we deigned to take 180,000 or something, which we haven't even done. But I realized too that they don't want to come here. They wanted to stay with people that they knew who had left the country already when the Soviet Union fell. Ukrainians went to England and other parts of Europe to work. So a lot of the Ukrainians knew people in Europe, had relatives in Europe, and so they wanted to stay close by. And later on, when I went back to Ukraine in the summer, I was actually part of the refugee movement going back home, which we can talk about. But the morale was good, and it remains good. I'm in touch with people over there, because I'm going to go back, and the hardships that the Russians are bringing down on them really only makes them more defiant and stronger. And later in the slideshow, you'll see pictures of bombed out buildings and things like that. Have the Ukrainian flags put on them. It's the first thing you do, put the flag up. So yeah, they're determined they're determined to fight. And one of the early battles that really changed the war was over a freight airline depot outside of Kyiv, and basically what happened there was when the Russians began to land attack helicopters and military equipment, basically the Ukrainians had a riot of reservists, police, civilians. I don't know if you remember seeing on the news these guys making Molotov cocktails in their basements. If you couldn't find a gun, then you had a brick. And that's really how they have fought this war. And you have to understand too that they fought this war from a standing start. And later we'll talk about what was sent there from New Jersey, from Whippany, from the Ukrainian Cultural Center here, T-shirts, and socks and underwear and everything, because the Army had nothing. Nobody wears the same uniform because they're coming from all these different places. And, again, we didn't supply them with much in terms of weaponry until after they were driven. They drove the Russians out of the northern part of Ukraine into Kyiv, we didn't really supply them with anything of great value until they pushed them back out. So it's really been a bare knuckle fight for them, and you'll see in some of the pictures that defiance that I think is really important.
Mark, what was happening on the other side? What were the Polish people like during that refugee migration?
You know, this is such an interesting history because there's not a lot of love lost between the Ukrainians and the Polish on that border. The border shifted several times. There was, you know, the history is so complicated. You know, the ethnic wars, and in the 1940s there was Ukrainian nationalist attempted genocide of Poles who were living on that at that border. And one of the things that was interesting, you know, Lviv in Ukraine was actually part of Poland, and so this border has shifted. One of the things that was interesting, there are monuments to that event that we would drive by, taking the Ukrainians, you know, deeper into Poland. And so in this very area, there was still a lot of bad blood. People were one generation removed from this event that happened in World War II, right? But they have a common enemy, and the Polish probably hate the Russians almost as much as the Ukrainians do, and the Polish are also interesting because probably no country in the world knows as well as they do what it's like to be sold out by the West, and they're watching this unfold before their eyes again. You know, there's a treaty that was signed in 1992 that said Ukraine will give up their nuclear weapons if under the promise that Russia will never invade them and the United States will defend them if they do. Throw it in the garbage. Just like the war, you know, just when Poland had a treaty with England and France to open up a Western Front if they were invaded by the Nazis. Never happened. At the end of World War II, Stalin wants Poland, let's just give them Poland, you know. And so the Poles are incredibly sympathetic to this idea that they know what it's like to be abandoned. And I think that was really the font of their generosity, you know, and they were incredibly generous. These people had free hotel rooms. There was food everywhere for them. There was free transportation, free train tickets. You could, you know, I would drive somebody to the train station in Warsaw. They would have a ticket to go to Berlin for free. Incredibly generous, and I think it was all based on that understanding that it's happened to us before, and we're not so sure it's not going to happen to us again. And in the time that I was there, very early on, I saw the Polish military amassing on that border to a great degree, especially up by Belarus. And I actually thought that if Kyiv fell, if it falls at any point again, that Poland might actually even break with NATO and say, well, you guys are sitting around doing nothing, we're going to go fight this war. And they're well equipped to do that.
And that, Mark, being said, it's a great segue into NATO, which of course was always Vladimir Putin's fear that NATO was going to impact that region. Any feeling from you with the Ukrainians? Do they look to enhance the relationship with the West?
Well, they have. And, you know, this idea that, you know, Putin needs to have a buffer between him and the West is absurd. They're a sovereign nation. They make a decision for themselves. If he wants a buffer, build the wall. You know, I hate to use the term, but, you know, put up your own iron curtain. You know, move it back on your border. we should not allow anyone in the world to determine the fate of a sovereign nation. And people say, well, we just can't go around policing the world in all these places. And that's true, but all these other places that we've gone, these are internal fights. The only time we've been when Iraq invaded Kuwait, we went in, and that was because a nation was being invaded. But in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, and all these other places, we are inserting ourselves into what are basically civil wars, right? Or situations within a country. This is the invasion of a country, an invasion of a sovereign nation. And this excuse that, well, he needs a buffer or that he feels threatened by NATO is patently ridiculous, because they have made a decision who they want to be. And that has nothing to do with the sovereignty of his nation. If Russia put missiles in Canada, we'd obviously be concerned, but we would deal with them diplomatically on it, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're not going to go invade Canada, right? And so, if we did, we would be wrong, because Canada would make that decision. So I think that one of the things that and I don't mean to be very heavy-handed about this, and if I'm offending anybody, I'm sorry. But when we talk about being the leaders of the free world and standing for democracy and going into these places where people either have no concept of democracy, they hate us before we even get there, and then to not go into a place where people want us, they're asking for us, they love us, and they are already a free and democratic nation. Something about that makes absolutely no sense to me. And then to watch the humanitarian crisis, the murder of civilians, the war crimes that are still being uncovered. It's really. I went there, and for the first time in my life, I was ashamed to be an American. I really was, and I just sat back and I just thought, everything I believed that this country stood for turns out to not be true. It was a lie, That's how I felt. I felt like, the kid who just found out there's no Santa Claus. Just like, this is a lie. We don't believe these things. We don't stand for these things. And one of the interesting things to me about this, and I know maybe I'm going a little bit off track, when we talk about nuclear war and fear of nuclear war and all this stuff, our satellite spy images and stuff, we know where everything is. We know exactly what they have. We know we could watch them move it. For them to use their strategic nuclear weapons, or their tactical nuclear weapons, they need to drive them from a place to another place to launch them. We know where those places are. This idea that if we get involved, he might use nuclear weapons is patently ridiculous, and it remains ridiculous, and it's proven out. They're taking a beating on the battlefield. They're being economically sanctioned, and they're still not threatening to they're threatening to use nuclear weapons, but there's no evidence that they're going to do that. I don't even know if their stuff works. It's kind of hard to imagine that a country that can't get their tanks started, has these ballistic power to blow up the world 1 million times. It's just.
Mark, what I'd like to do, if possible here, answer just one question is maybe you can set up the Ukrainian map like you had up once before, and we'll open it up to the public for some questions. But, you and I had talked previously, and, we talk about leadership and the power of leadership and how people can galvanize. We often refer to Winston Churchill in World War II and how, against all odds, turned the fate of that war around.
Yes.
What do you feel and hear about President Zelensky?
Well, I think that there's people over there that don't like him. There's legitimate concerns about corruption. They're an Eastern European nation that was a Soviet nation. Of course there's corruption. There's corruption in our country. But I think he has done an amazing job galvanizing the people. And I did meet people there that don't like him, you know, but that's to be understood. That's predictable. But again, I go back to what I said earlier about, you know, setting that tone. You know, I don't want to ride. I want weapons. This kind of poking at Russia in these ways that are, man, you know, like, you know, one of the phrases that kept annoying me in the very beginning of this is, we don't want to provoke Putin. We don't want to provoke Putin. We don't want to provoke Putin. Well, Zelensky continually provokes Putin. You know, the statements that come out, we are now seeing the best side of the Russian army, their backs. You know, they took all of the destroyed Russian tanks and stuff, and for their Independence Day parade, they mocked the Russians, you know, May Day parade with all the stuff. You know, they put it all down the street. You know, so like, here's the parade of Russians' military might, a bunch of blown up tanks, and stuff. And so this idea that they are, you know, he continues to talk about resilience. He continues to talk about the sacrifices that they were making, the deaths, the losses, the war crimes. He's not letting it fall out of the global view. And the continuing, you know, asking for weapons, the continued attention to what is actually happening to his people. I think he has galvanized the people. He's showing tremendous leadership, and he is, you know, telling them they're going to win. They're going to win this war. They're not, you know, the only thing they have to fear is fear itself. You know, the whole kind of that rhetoric of leadership. I think he's doing very well with that.
Good. Mark, if you could slide that down towards the Black Sea in one way or another and see Crimea. So let's see if we have a few questions from the audience for Mark before we go back to the pictures. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask? Yes.
What's the projected time frame for this war continuing? Because now that Putin has they're destroying hospitals, schools, all the infrastructure. They're going to go through one of the cold winters now, no food. So how long can they go like that? And I agree with you, we should be supporting them. It's stupid to watch on TV a democratic country being, you know, the people, innocent people being killed.
Yeah, I mean, they're bombing maternity hospitals, and those are facts. Those are facts. I mean, I have seen with my own two eyes the destruction of hospitals, mental institutions. You know, what is the strategic advantage of blowing up a mental institution? You know, I have seen, and I will show you, destruction of farm villages. There's no strategic value except to terrorize people, to blow up people's homes that are in the middle of nowhere. You know, it's almost like vandalism. You know, they gave these kids a bunch of tanks and they decided to run down the street and just blow up everything as if they were egging a house. But then in the big picture, you know, what you're talking about is exactly right. You know, and this is the question this is the big question to me. We know who they are. We know what they do. It's a Soviet mentality. We've seen it for 100 years. Scorched earth tactics, kill everybody, rape women, do everything that is inhumane, imprison people. We've seen it. And I don't know why this is a shock to anybody. So, number one, what is the tipping point of the humanitarian crisis before the world finally says, okay, enough. Enough. You can't do this anymore. What does he have to kill? Does he have to kill 1 million people, 2 million people? Does he have to destroy every hospital? Where is that tipping point, number one? And number two, why didn't we see it coming to begin with? You know, if you study the history of this mentality, this Soviet mentality. If you know the history of it, you know that it's coming. It's not a surprise to anybody. It sure as hell isn't a surprise to the Ukrainians. You know, pits of 500, people bound and shot in the head. It's just, I wish I could answer your question about when does this end? When does somebody finally say, you wanted the Third World War, you have it. We're coming in with 300,000, 500,000 NATO troops, and we are going to destroy you and push you back to your border. When does that happen? And in the meantime, I think one of the most outrageous things of this whole, from the political standpoint, was when our State Department people went over and said to Zelensky, we want to help you weaken the Russian army so they can never do this again. And, if I'm Zelensky, I'm saying, well, then, come on, join the fight. Why are my people the sacrificial lambs? Why is my infrastructure, my country being destroyed? Because you want to see me weaken the Russian army. I can't even believe the ham-handedness of a statement, public statement like that. And that was Austin and Blinken that went over and said that.
Yes.
Mark, what kind of credentials did you need to get into Ukraine and wander around on your own with a rental car? I mean, it seems absurd that they'd say, oh, well, here comes a guy, and we'll just let him do what he wants.
U.S. passport.
That's it? That's all you needed?
That thing is gold over there. One of the interesting things of this is the Ukrainians are so thankful for what we're doing. It's almost embarrassing that they're just so thankful about the support that they're getting from the United States. And it's just sort of their mentality is like, oh, well, the U.S. is on our side and Britain's on our side and they're helping us, because in the very beginning, they had no help. So I went over and had a passport. I was able to move around wherever I wanted. I went through all the checkpoints, and I'll show you later if we don't run out of time. I ended up in some pretty interesting places, like in a camp 3 kilometers from Belarus. I delivered a military truck 30 kilometers from the Russian border. Another one halfway between Kyiv and the front. And, they're just thankful to have the help. Yes?
One more question. Can you give me an idea of just how big Ukraine is?
I had the map up.
Yeah, I think it's...
The map.
I mean,
Texas, the size of Texas.
It's the size of Texas. It's the biggest country in Europe after Russia. It's a big country. From Kyiv to Poland is about 500 kilometers. And from Kyiv to Mariupol is probably about 800 kilometers. So it's 6.2, what is it? 6.2 kilometers. What's the conversion? You're nodding, you know it.
Yeah, so 500 kilometers is about 310 miles.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah, that gives you an idea. I drove from Kyiv to Lviv in 4 or 5 hours. And they don't have the best roads in the world either. So, so I want to show you what I was just talking about before we go any further. And I'll show you these pictures. But I took a military, not a military truck, but a heavy-duty SUV that was purchased to give to the military from Kyiv, and I drove it to Chernihiv, which is close to the Russian. Here's Russia, and here's Belarus. So this is about 60 kilometers from Russia and 20 kilometers from Belarus.
Anybody shoot at you?
No. And then I was in 2 camps. One was up in here, north. I was 3 kilometers from the Belarusian border. and another one was in here. And this is the area where the Ukrainians bombed their own dams and flooded out a bunch of villages to slow the Russian advance at the mouth of the Dnipro River. And in this area here, when I'll show you the pictures of the camps and how they live, what the Ukrainians do is, when they don't really have bases and forts like we would have here, they do, but they don't populate them with people. When they rotate them out of the front, they go to these remote farm areas, and they live like 5 or 6 guys to a house, cell phones off, because they don't want the Russians to see them congregating in a place, because they'll blow them up. So we'll get to that later on in the discussion.
Do we have another question before he moves on with the pictures? Yes.
I was wondering how you balanced or thought about your different hats, like, because I know you've been doing reporting and actually, filing some stories, and then, but also you're helping. I don't know if you ever had the experience of being able to tangibly help before as a journalist. I just wondered what the experience has been like to be able to help concretely, but also you're still a writer and still reporting.
That's a good question, really, because we tangibly, I like the way you put that, tangibly help in things like Hurricane Sandy and things like that. Even though you'd be on the scene, I mean, I think I never really was the kind of journalist that said, "Let me just observe." If somebody needed help getting out of their basement, I'd help them. Or things like that. There were times when, as a journalist, part of the experience is being involved. I don't ascribe to the idea that I should keep the camera on while someone's being assaulted. I think I should put the camera down and jump into the fight, But I didn't go over there to write. I went over there, again, I don't want to self-aggrandize, I went over there because I was disgusted, and I wanted to help and be involved in this. But, then you're there, and you're in the middle of something that, very few people get to experience, especially as I moved from Poland into Ukraine. There's an aspect of this war, I think, that's really not being covered well at all, and that's the massive humanitarian aspect of it. People are putting their lives on the line to help these people in huge numbers. The World Global Kitchen and the Salvation Army, the Knights of Columbus. There's all sorts of groups over there that are very involved in the humanitarian effort.
And Mark, what other countries, what other citizens from other countries did you come across there?
England, mostly. In the very beginning of the war, there were a lot of Europeans bringing stuff. These guys from England came with 2 tour buses loaded with stuff, and they put Ukrainian refugees on them and took them back to England. A caravan of Italian campers did the same thing, dropped off tons of stuff, and then went back with the people. Not so many Americans, because it's different for us. It's a long trip. Europe's small, or don't have to cross an ocean, don't have to fly. But the British, I think, American veterans and British veterans are over there in a big number, either helping with their military or even people like me that are trying to do humanitarian work, that have some interest in, the freedom and democracy aspect of this. Okay, what's next?
Well, I think you're going to move forward with those pictures that you brought in, and maybe tell us a little bit about them as we move forward.
Yeah, okay, so got to keep an eye on the clock here, right? This is in Ukraine. In Poland. This is they have the Costco's of Poland are called Tesco's, and the Polish government shut them down and opened them all up as refugee centers for the people. And the next couple pictures are from those refugee centers. The Polish Girl Scouts, which is different, a little different than scouting here. They're in it till like in their early 20s. They had classes for the people, the kids, and drawings and school. Again, the demographic is, just people, handicapped people. This is a family I took from a town called Przemyśl, which is in the southeast part of Poland, which from a Tesco there, brought them to Warsaw. And there's another family, and these two pictures kind of show the economic diversity of the people, and this is a very poor family. This family's not as poor. Just more of pictures of the people coming out. This is in Poland. This is also in Helm. I went up to Tiraspol with a woman, very poor area, right on the Belarusian border. I ended up going into Belarus accidentally. My phone went bing, welcome to Belarus. Your Verizon travel pass has started. I'm like, hey, Verizon may welcome you to Belarus. The police aren't going to. I better get out of here. And this is where I began to see the military buildup and great concern about a lot of security. So I got out of my car to take a picture of an Easter parade. Easter in Poland is a week before our Easter. And as I got back in my car, the Border Patrol blocked me in. Who are you? What are you doing here? Why are you taking pictures? And an hour later, I convinced them that, I wasn't a threat. Made my way into Kyiv in my second trip, again, probably pretty early in the war, where Kyiv was, there were still refugees coming out. And I was there. It's kind of a long story, but I got stranded in Kyiv. I was with these guys that I decided to separate from because in that first picture with the man with the red cross on his jacket, we were bringing in medical supplies, and they had military stuff in the load of stuff, which was discovered. And since I was the only one that didn't speak the language, I was a little uncomfortable that I would be the one spending 10 years in a Polish prison. And so when we got to Lviv, I separated from them because I didn't really trust them. Ended up in Kyiv, and this was when things were locked down and everything was dark, and there were air raid sirens going off. I ended up in the basement of this building a couple times during the time I was there with missile sirens going off. And this was a very unnerving experience because at this point in the war, Russia had jammed up all their internet and cell phones. My cell phone didn't work. My internet didn't work. I couldn't get any money. There was no food or water in the train station. Everything was wiped out. There was nothing open around the train station. And so I was stranded between Lviv and Kyiv. I spent 36 hours stranded there, 27 of which I spent on trains going back and forth. And it was kind of unnerving, but you got through it okay. And then on my next trip back, I worked with a group of people. We brought stuff into Ukraine. This was a refugee center that we dropped stuff off. Here's me working. These were guys that were burned in a strike outside of Yakoviv, Ukraine, where there was a international military training center. These were some of the men that were burned in that. The men that were worse, more badly injured, were taken to a bigger military hospital. And I think 60 people were killed in that attack. Just some pictures of the homemade bunkers and roadblocks that people were putting up to protect their businesses, to protect their farm villages. And then this is in the summer when I start going back. This is the warehouse where I was working. All that stuff was being donated by the Whippany Center. And they have sent 18 truckloads of stuff, truckloads, containers of stuff to Ukraine, and that's growing. They financed 12 vehicles, 2 ambulances. They're financing a school bus to be turned into an operating room. And if you're interested in donating any money to them, please do. They've done an enormous amount of work. The Ukrainian community here is very proud. I meet people at the Ukrainian Center, and they all speak Ukrainian, and I've been to Ukraine more than most of them. So they cling to their culture. It's very interesting. So we were bringing stuff to these places, and so that's what I did most of the summer. This speaks to the effort. In the basement of this warehouse where I was working, which is actually a museum, closed museum, and any other place that I went where they were collecting stuff, there were women and children in the basements of these places making camouflage, day in and day out, this painstaking work, making camouflage for the military. And it just kind of speaks to that war effort, the national war effort, to do whatever you can to help the military.
Mark, as you traveled through Ukraine and you went into these back roads and these little villages, like, what is the day in and day out life for them? Do they still have commerce or stores open? Can you go to a restaurant?
Well, when I was in Kyiv in the summer, it was pretty normal, except for the missile alerts and the roadblocks and things like that. It was pretty normal. Now that they're rebombing infrastructure, it's much different. I'm hearing from friends over there, people I know, that they have no heat, they have no electricity, they're rationing everything. There's a woman that I know whose daughter has leukemia. We're trying to see if we're going to get her here because they have very good health care over there, but the hospitals are being bombed. And so we want to see if we can get the kid over here. But now, in the little villages, I'll show you the destruction in a little while. Just as a quick aside, this is kind of a funny story, but in this room where we had all the military stuff, there's all these T-shirts from New Jersey that are being sent by the by the Whippany Center. This guy,
Berkeley Heights.
No, it's actually West Milford.
West Milford Highlanders? Okay.
This guy, Andrew, was a wounded soldier. He had some shrapnel wounds. They asked me if he could stay in my apartment overnight. He was going to go back to his base in Trinidad. Sure. He shows up and he's wearing this shirt. So, knowing what I know, that's West Milford. That's the West Milford nickname and colors. We had 6 kids play sports. Whatever. And so I go on the website. I said, this is girls softball. He had no idea what he goes. Baseball for girls. Yeah, that's exactly right. So this speaks to what they didn't have. We're sending them shirts to wear as undershirts. This is particularly cute. The Ridge Senior Bash. We're making history. We graduated high school. No, these guys are making history. They're fighting the Russians. The next batch of pictures are from Buchka and Irpin, where the devastation was enormous, and the atrocities that were the first war crimes were uncovered in Buchka when the Russians withdrew, and I think you're all familiar with that. If you're not, I can answer questions about that, but it was just the horrors that were uncovered, and this is the destruction of, again, these are just, blowing up civilian apartment buildings, private homes.
Mark, did you ever come across artillery? Did you hear fighting in the background?
No, but I did see smoke from Kyiv when I was there, when they were still launching missile attacks in and around Kyiv. You see in this picture, and you'll see in other pictures, the Ukrainian flag. The black and red flag is a Cossack flag, and the idea of the black and red is it's what happens to blue and yellow when you drench it in blood. And so that is the symbol of their defiance. But you know, go back to that sense of defiance. You know, and all these buildings blown up. There's the Ukrainian flag. They're going to put it up. We're still here. This is a village called Motion, and I think this is one of those examples of just, you know, Russian vandalism, Russian abject destruction for no real reason. This is the best way I can probably describe it is like what Harding Township might have been like 30 years ago. It's still kind of rural, but people are moving in with like big houses. And so some of the people there are rural people, and then there's some beautiful homes. So we brought stuff, one of the many trips that we made, humanitarian trips with food, things like that. And these people were now living in their sheds. Their homes were destroyed. Everywhere you go, they want to take your picture. You know, they want to document that you're there, and they're very grateful. This woman had a beautiful home, and this was what was left of it. And now she is living in a barn. Everywhere we went, and this was multiple times, we dropped off food, we dropped off stuff, and everybody always made us lunch. You know, just the warmth of these people, the gratitude, sense of humor is just remarkable. And this is where she and her husband are living now. This is a road in motion that every single house was made uninhabitable in the town. The Russians never occupied this town because there was nothing to occupy. They blew everything up. One guy's house, he collected all the missile residual and mines and other stuff. You still got to do the laundry even though your house is blown up, right? Life just continues. The house, the military was there kind of protecting the town, what was left of it, and you see the house in the background is a substantial home. This picture is very hard to read, but it's very interesting. If this is a model home, beautiful wood structure, and you can see the shrubbery here and the chimney, and all that's left is the shrubbery and the chimney. You know, the rest of it was burned to the ground by the incendiary missiles. Everywhere you go in these villages, you see Russian vehicles blown up. This is Kyiv, life kind of back to normal, except for the tank hedgehogs, the checkpoints, etc. I was actually, I think I was the first journalist to write this story, because I wrote this even before July 4th, and when they had their liberation day was later in August, and end of August or early September. But they took all the Russian, they would bring these Russian destroyed vehicles into the public squares. This is St. Michael the Archangel Monastery. It's one of the most historic and public squares in the city. And they would display this stuff. And people would climb on it, and children would play on it, and people would take pictures. And at first it was a little unnerving, you know, to think, yeah, the girl's doing a ballerina pose on a tank where some Russian soldier was incinerated. But then when you begin to really understand the history and what these people have endured at the hands of the Russians, it starts to make some sense to you. I also want you to notice in this picture and the next picture, this is a public square with a lot of people, And if you look at the ground, there's not a speck of litter. The most amazing thing about Ukraine is this social construct that people like obey the rules. You know, they throw garbage in the garbage can. Everybody smokes, and there's no cigarette butts on the ground. They walk over to the ash cans and they put them out. When the traffic light's red, they all wait, even if there's no cars coming. When it turns green, they all walk across the street. There's just this incredible order to the society. So this is a video that I took to send back to New Jersey Spotlight News. You can hear the religious chanting in the background. And I start to walk down the street. These are all the soldiers that have been killed. And I know I can only send a video that is like 30 seconds back home that will work. So I'm walking and I'm walking and I'm walking and I'm realizing I'm going to run out of time. So I start to take the long view, and you can see that it goes as far as the eye can see of all these young men that were killed. The Russian mentality is your history, your language, your culture, we will erase and replace it with ours. The Ukrainians have experience with this, so they have sandbagged up many of their monuments because they're afraid the Russians are going to blow them up. And this is the monument of Saint Olga, who is actually the ruler in the 800s that tamed, barbarian groups to start the Kievan Rus society, which has become Ukraine and Russia.
Mark, if we could,
Yeah.
maybe you can go back to the map for a split second. Let's go back to the audience for a few questions and do a little catch up before we finalize it. Can you again go up to show Crimea and the Black Sea? And prior to opening it up to the audience, I have a question for you. Let's talk strategically. So what exactly, we've heard about, obviously we know the annexation of Crimea. What exactly is the Russian goal here as far as strategically cutting off from Ukraine any type of access to the Black Sea?
Well, that's what they wanted. They wanted to take over the entire Black Sea, and they wanted to take over the mineral-rich industrial belts here in the Luhansk and the Donetsk, which are this part of Ukraine. So they were beaten out of Kharkiv, and Poltava is where I brought one of the jeeps, and I'll show you that in a minute. They were driven out of Kharkiv. They've been driven out of many of the towns around here. They've been driven out of the east side of, or the western side of the Dnipro River. Kherson is just where they've most recently been driven out of.
Are these territories that at one point were claimed by the Russians and
Yes.
then reclaimed by the Ukrainians?
Yes, Kherson was the biggest city that they had, and they had the sham elections to say we now want to be part of Russia, and now they don't control any of those some of those areas where they held those elections. Kherson being the major city. They've not gotten into Odessa. They failed to take over Mykolaiv. This Zaporia here, however you say it, is where the nuclear power plant is. And so the Ukrainians are actually driving them pretty much out of some of those areas. But it's an expansive country, and Mariupol is where they were holed up in that steel plant and stayed there for months before surrendering. And then the Russians blew up the dorm where they were keeping the soldiers, the prisoners of war. So yeah, that was the Russian plan. So why they decided to invade Kyiv was, I think, just to try to take over the government and make the rest of it easier. And having failed at that, now they're on their heels. And so what we're seeing now, obviously, is a terror campaign to get the people to buckle under.
So, good, thank you, Mark. So let's challenge our guest lecturer tonight with a couple good questions. Since he has his boots on the ground, and to us, it's unfortunately for us, Mark, it's more of a news clip. You know, we really
Yep.
can't get the feel, but it's certainly moving for us. So, who would have a question for Mark Ionno?
Pete?
So the missile attacks that
Yeah.
what we hear about, right? Are they being launched by the Russians from Russian-held Ukrainian territory, or are those launchers in Russia?
Some are coming from Belarus, some are coming from Russia, and some are coming from the submarines in the Black Sea. And again, this is part of the frustration of our inaction. In the Crimean Peninsula, this is the headquarters of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Ukrainian operatives or terrorists, according to the Russians, blew up 8 of their aircraft, which was half of the aircraft in the Black Sea Fleet, 8 of 16. The United States Sixth Fleet, which is sitting in Naples twiddling its thumbs right now, has 174 military aircraft. 2 aircraft carriers, a whole bunch of destroyers and fast frigates and stuff. And why we are allowing this guy to first blockade grain and then now to basically work out a deal with him to allow the grain, rather than telling Turkey, we're sailing in the Black Sea, we're sailing the Sixth Fleet into the Black Sea, whether you guys like it or not. We know you want to be the big mediators here, but tough luck. This is international law. The United States Navy, by the way, was formed to protect the sea lanes across the world. It's beginning in 1830s with our war against the Barbary pirates. So this is nothing new for the role of the U.S. Navy. It's so frustrating to me that we have this power. The Ukrainians sank the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet basically with a big firework. They launched from Odessa and sank this Russian battleship. We have so much naval firepower. We could put this guy's Navy, Black Sea Fleet, underneath the sea in probably, literally, without exaggeration, maybe half a day. And we're just allowing this to continue and happen. The Russian nuclear submarine fleet in the Black Sea runs on diesel fuel. So you don't even have to bomb them, you have to just bomb the gas station. They run on diesel fuel. It's preposterous how backward their military is, and yet I sound like a broken record. Let me stop.
Questions?
Yes.
Is there anyone in the military that is thinking the way you are? Or, they must be more frustrated than anyone.
I would imagine they
have the
are.
power to just stop all this carnage and are just watching it on television.
Yeah, I would hope that there are. And I know that, and I have met and I do know there are American military operatives, ex-military operatives over there, British and Americans, that are training these guys, that are helping them fight this war. I would imagine that we have other government operatives over there, but that doesn't change the fact that we are not being muscular in our approach and leading in this situation to get the world to stop the carnage of these people. And the sanctions and all that other stuff, all that slow-moving diplomacy is good, unless you're the people getting bombs dropped on your head. Then it's no good. Then you're asking, like, where is everybody? And again, we go back to the same thing. What is the tipping point? Where is that tipping point where we finally say, enough's enough?
Mark, there was a question before, and I want to go back to it. And you again being there 4 times, going back for a 5th. You know, how does this war end? What do you envision? Does it happen because maybe Russian society starts an upheaval? Does it happen because of, unfortunately, a major bombing that could have shut down a society completely? How's this war going to finalize?
You know, I wish I knew, honestly, because the way it's going, you know, it's interesting. This is just kind of a very interesting little bit of history. World War I, the trench warfare in World War I, if you know anything about the history of when everyone dug in, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of men were killed for gains of less than 10 kilometers. You know, just this stalemate of death. You know, and you know, where a war is fought, nobody wins. And so now the Ukrainians sort of have been pushed to a point where if they give in anything, all those lives that they gave up are for nothing. So they've been put, and again, you know, this is a curious thing about the diplomacy. You know, we have put, the world has put them in a position to not be able to give up, to have to fight to the bitter end. Because if they give any quarter, it's a loss. Even if they give up the Crimean Peninsula, which, you know, everybody turned a blind eye for Russia annexing that. They want that back now. They want everything back. They've been put in a position to demand that. So, Zelensky says, yeah, we'll negotiate when you leave. Then we'll negotiate. When you rebuild our country, you answer for the war crimes and you give us back our land, then we'll negotiate. So they're in it for the long haul. How does it end? In my fantasy world, it ends like Hitler ends. You know, the country is broken, humiliated, driven back to their borders, demilitarized, and the world can go on without the threat of that Soviet mentality. But I don't really, you know, I don't know how it ends. I don't know where is face saving outweigh the loss of life and the cost and all those other things. It's very complicated. I do think that there is more unrest in Russia than we were aware of. Clearly, as they say, when he instituted the draft, they voted with their feet, as they say, right? They ran out of the country. Nobody wants to fight the war. And one of the interesting things about this is, Russia is basically a bunch of republics that were kind of taken over by Russia, and the Asiatic people of of Siberia, they're the ones being used as the cannon fodder. You know, the Asiatic minorities and the poor areas of Siberia. It's where the soldiers are coming from. And they might be facing unrest in those republics that will equal, what the citizenry in Moscow and St. Petersburg are feeling now if the war is coming home to them. I think Putin's been very careful not to draft, the Muscovites and the people from St. Petersburg, to keep it a war of these, Siberian minorities, ethnic minorities. So to answer the question, I don't know how it's going to end. I just have no idea.
So Mark, for the last 7 or 8 minutes, why don't you summarize with your pictures and let's come to a conclusion.
Well, I'd really like to move through a couple things to show you some very interesting things. This is taking the Jeep to Chernigov, the destruction along the road that the Russians came down, blowing up gas stations, destroying homes. Again, there's the Ukrainian flag. That was a cultural center. They bombed a restaurant, and you start to see the turrets on the tanks are facing north now, not south, as these were blown up in the Russian retreat. This is the truck that I took to Chernihiv. There's the same guy. Now he's wearing the Ridge shirt. And this truck, see in the corner there's a flag. I was being waved through all the checkpoints, and everybody's waving to me. And then I got there, I realized, oh, well, you're driving a military vehicle. I said, oh, well, great. I'm 30 kilometers from Russia. I wish you'd told me that to begin with. More pictures of that destruction. This is a village that we delivered stuff to. This old woman here had a great story. There were 200 rocket launchers in her front yard. She befriended the Russians. She probably saved the lives of many people in that village. When they left, all they did was steal everything. They didn't hurt anybody because she made them food. She loaned them their car. Her husband said they're so stupid they put diesel into a petrol vehicle. They wrecked my car. But she was just one of the great characters. This is in August, and these people are still lining up for household goods, food. We brought stuff to them out of my rental car. This takes a little explaining. This is Hostomel, and this is where the air freight place was. And this is the marketplace that they have built. This woman I met was determined to open up her women's, underwear store because she wanted life to kind of go back to normal. Her house was still uninhabitable, and this is the business next to her business. This was the market that was a supermarket that no longer exists, and they had to build. They took all the cars that were incinerated in all these Russian attacks, and they put them in one place, probably about 1,000 cars. I love this picture. It's probably my favorite picture in the collection. It's hard to see, but there's a woman working in the office, in her home office, right above the roof pitch there. You know, there's a tank explode. They blew her house up with a tank shell, and she is going to continue working whether her house is going to fall apart or not. Again, just sense of defiance. In the background is that freight, is the Antonov freight airport, which the Ukrainians drove the Russians out when they first landed. Russians came back and took it back over, but the Ukrainians had destroyed everything of value. So the Russians could not fly in all the things that they wanted to fly in to take over Kyiv. And they had to then drive down with all the tanks and stuff. And the first thing people in this town did was rebuild their public park and their children's playground. That's the first thing they did in the public space, was rebuild the children's playground. And again, it's a great act of defiance. I was able to go to places other people weren't. This is a basement of a government building in Kyiv, which is where a reserve unit was housed. And if you look at the width of the concrete in that door and the door itself, this was a Soviet building built in the 50s. And this bomb shelter was built to protect them against us if we started a nuclear war. And now the Ukrainians are using it to protect them against the Russians. This is where the people stayed, and I'm sure they were back there recently. This is my trip to Poltava, which was about more than halfway toward the front, and going through the Ukrainian countryside. The Russians came in, their GPS didn't work. They couldn't figure out where they were going. The Ukrainians blacked out all the road signs, so they got lost. And these are the guys who were afraid it can blow up the world a million times. Farmers took everything they could to protect the entries to their crops. All these signs are about mines that are there. They asked me to drive a truck to Poltava. It's 200 miles southeast of Kyiv. I said, sure. They neglected to tell me it was a British setup. that the steering wheel is on the right-hand side. Still, I got there. My favorite quote came from this guy here from the whole trip. There was a rule that we could not take pictures and publish pictures of soldiers. We had to black out their faces and stuff. And I said, well, let's take this picture, but if I get this published, don't worry, we'll cover your faces. The guy says, don't worry about that. We've been fighting these guys since 2014. They know who we are. Loved it. More destruction. So now, this is sort of getting toward the end of the slideshow. And this was a Soviet children's camp, a camp from the Soviet days that was so bizarre. And this is where a motor pool from the front now came to stay and work on trucks and get trucks back up and running. There were Winnie the Pooh and Tigger paintings on the buildings. You can see how everything's run down. But this is how they live when they're rotated out of the front. We brought food to them and stuff. And it was a real privilege to be able to be there in these situations. And they're roughing it. This is how they operate. Not like the United States Army or other sophisticated Western armies where there's forts and people to cook for them and all that stuff.
Mark, did you come across a lot of women fighting?
Yes, there are a lot of women fighting, and some of the women they're fighting have husbands that have been killed and or boyfriends that have been killed. This is a refugee center, and for children, some of them were orphaned in Bovary, outside of Kyiv. It wasn't all bad there, but the reason this picture exists, the blonde woman in the middle, you've seen in other pictures, and the other woman, these are two women that lost their jobs. The woman in the black started this children's refugee center. The woman in the middle, who has a deaf daughter and her mother, who fled to Germany, stayed to start foundations to help the military, help other refugees, help people that have lost everything. The previous pictures are about this rebirth of Ukrainian culture. The Russians say there is no Ukraine and there are no Ukrainians, which has kicked off this incredible movement of them, worshiping their culture. This is the last. This is the last fort that I was in. This was 3 kilometers from the Belarusian border. And we delivered some stuff up there. And again, this is how these soldiers lived. These guys were an artillery unit that was in the front. They were on the front. They were back out of the front. Candy and bombs. We had dinner together, and again, I said, "Don't worry, we'll black out your faces." And they said, "Don't worry about our faces, black out the beer. We're not supposed to be drinking." This guy here could speak English, and we went out one night. I spent the night in the car because I couldn't make it back by the curfew from there. This was up. Chernihiv is where I brought the first truck. Poltava is where I brought the second truck. And this fort that I was at, this place where these guys were, was north of Chernobyl. It was like right here on the Belarusian border. And so the guy with the beard, we were outside, and I've never seen a sky like this in my life. There were more stars than there was black spaces in between them. And we're looking up, and all of a sudden these things are just moving around in these erratic ways, 6 or so, just moving around. And I think, oh man, UFOs, what is that? And he points up and he says, Elon Musk. And we could actually see the Starlink satellites that Elon Musk was giving them to communicate, because the Russians jammed up all their internet stuff. You could see them with the naked eye from there. It was pretty amazing. So that's the experience.
Well, it's a heck of an experience and very well done, Mark Ionno. Thank you very much. Fred, question?
Mark, a fascinating presentation, thank you. Here in the U.S., we live in relative calm. In the Ukraine, in a country under battle, how does it change the people? How does it change the nation?
Well, I think, there's unity, great unity. I mean, even the idea of no cigarette butts being on the ground. There's a sense of pride, national pride. There's a sense of national unity. When you're in a war, you put everything aside. There are political differences, but, what I think, and not to glamorize it, but I think that their desire and respect to live as a free people supersedes all the other internal squabble. Man, I wish we had that here. I wish we could get back to that in our country at some point and start to look at the big picture of who we are and what we stand for rather than who we're not and what we did wrong in the past or whatever,
Kind of like the spirit that you and I have talked about after 9/11.
Sure, yeah. I mean, and we don't, I think that was one of the reasons I love being over there, is this just sense of order and the sense of identity, that they have. Not a sense of how do we separate our identity from everyone else, in the country and put ourselves in a different category of victimization or whatever it is, political partisanship. It's just Poland's the same way. I feel that, the people have this, they're a growing country. They're new. They're ancient with great histories, but they're new. They're on the threshold of great economy and enjoying the freedom that they lost for decades under Soviet rule. That's what I see there, and that's one of the reasons I keep getting pulled back. I really like it over there.
Well, we're not giving him up here in New Jersey yet because he's so New Jersey. Unless there's another question or two, I know it's getting late at 8:30, but Mark Ionno, you are such a
One more thing. How can we donate to your cause to get you?
Well, you can. I'll pass the hat in a minute. The Ukrainian Cultural Center of New Jersey. Yeah, if you just go onto their website, they have a donation button, and it'd be great if you can throw some money at them. I raised a lot of money out of Friendships webpage, my community, the Summit Friends. Dispersed with all of it. I'm going to go back. I'm not going to raise any more money. But there's so much money being donated through that center, and they're doing amazing work. That's just a great story in itself.
certainly doesn't seem like they need any more T-shirts, that's for
No.
sure. So Basking Ridge and everybody else. Mark Ionno, we can't thank you enough on behalf of the Summit Library and HTTV, and we're so blessed to have you as a Summitite originally,
Right,
and
enough.
we will have you back. We will have you back, that's for sure. But thank
Thanks,
you so
John.
much.
Thank you.